Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the Oxford Martin School. Really delighted this evening to have two really fantastic speakers, each of who could have spoken in their own right for many hours and indeed have very often, but together are a real treat for us. And I'm also delighted that we'll end at about 5 and that'll be followed at 5:30 by a lecture by Gary Kasparov, which will also be a treat. So we have a wonderful few hours in store for us. Lord Martin Rees was President of the Royal Society for 5 years. He's the Astronomer Royal of Her Majesty's government, or Her Majesty, I think, is, and was the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge, has been in many different roles, influential in debates about science, the future of science, and of course was a catalyst for the formation of the Oxford Martin School. His friendship with James Martin and his book, Our Final Century, which I would encourage you to read if you haven't read it, was very influential in helping Jim to think about the sorts of choices we face and the urgency of needing to bring great minds together to tackle the problems of the 21st century. Martin has also been a key member of the advisory board of the Oxford Martin School since its inception. I think you've been to all our meetings, so thank you for that. And has been a member of the commission, the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations, and very engaged in our work now for the long term. So I'm absolutely delighted that Martin could be here this evening and talk to us about some of his thinking that went into the commission and these long-term issues. I'm also delighted that he'll be joined by Sir John Beddington. Sir John is now the advisor to the Oxford Martin School. He's working with us, advising us on our strategy, on our research, on the sorts of things we should be doing, and has become an absolutely key right-hand person to me personally, and I'm absolutely delighted that he's at Oxford and at the Oxford Martin School. Prior to this, prior to May this year, he was chief scientist of the government, played an absolutely key role in pushing the foresight activities of government on a whole range of areas, working from questions of identity and high-speed trading to questions of the future of food and farming and many other areas. I actually first encountered him and work on environment and migration, which was also part of that. Sir John, who has both an economics and a zoology background, is a polymath working across many areas and has been absolutely wonderful in helping us as well in thinking about how we can make a difference. So I'm delighted to welcome them both. The way this is going to work is first Lord Rees is going to speak. He'll be followed by Sir John, and then we'll have a discussion. So you have the floor, Martin.
Thank you very much, Ian. It's a great, can you hear me? Yes. Okay. It's a great pleasure to be here, and it was a great privilege to be a member of the commission chaired by Pascal Lamy, and I'm going to comment briefly. I've got no PowerPoints myself, on some of our recommendations and to discuss how we can maximize the chance to have an impact. I'm really just a warm-up speaker for John Beddington. He wasn't on the commission, but he benefits from great experience and active involvement in policy questions. So I'll speak briefly to leave him plenty of time. Well, I'm an astronomer, so I'm going to start with a sort of cosmic vignette.
I think that might be too loud.
We've all seen pictures of the Earth from space, iconic ones for environmentalists. But suppose some aliens had been watching the Earth for its entire history. Well, for 45 million centuries, things changed pretty slowly. Continents drifted, ice cover rose and fell. But in just one century, they'd have seen unprecedented accelerating changes. Massive alterations to the Earth's vegetation and land cover, an anomalous rapid rise in atmospheric CO2, and so forth. And indeed, the 21st century is the first in the Earth's history when one species, namely ours, has the power to determine the fate of the entire biosphere. We've entered what some people call the Anthropocene, when the worst threats come from humans, collectively and individually, and not from nature. Well, what brought all the Commission members to the table, 19 of them, was a shared global perspective, a shared belief that a prosperous, equitable and sustainable global future is possible, but a shared concern that this prospect is in jeopardy, largely because modern politics and business have become too preoccupied with short-term pressures. The electoral cycle, quarterly profits of PLCs, etc. And the problem is not only a short time horizon. There's a damagingly constricted territorial and nationalistic focus when the challenges really demand global solutions and global sympathies. The glaring deprivations of faraway people today, Paul Collier's bottom billion, aren't high enough on our radar screen. And that being so, it's surely going to be so much harder for us to focus on the welfare of the bottom billion's counterparts 50 years hence. But let's not be too gloomy. There's been some progress towards the Millennium Goals, but an important point I want to make, which the Commission made, is that in assessing how far we're getting towards these goals, we still don't really have enough data. We can't be sure how well or badly we're doing, how well or badly some countries are doing. So one of the Commission's specific recommendations was to have a new international body to gather and publish reliable data on economic growth, literacy, life expectancies, and so forth. We need reliable performance indicators, and not just economic ones, of course. We need them to include health, institutional strengths, legal systems, etc. And these indicators will help to focus attention on good governance and incentivize efforts to reduce corruption and waste. One of the Commission's members was a remarkable man, Mo Ibrahim, the man who spearheaded the spread of mobile phones through Africa. He insisted that the worst problems in many developing countries are those of poor governance. Indeed, he famously endowed a prize to reward an effective and non-corrupt leader, and this prize has been awarded twice to the presidents of Mozambique and Botswana. So governance is important, and we need statistics to monitor progress, have performance indicators. But what about future generations? The focus of our report. What will the world be like in 2050? There are some trends we can bet on with confidence. By mid-century, the world will be more crowded. Its population will have risen from 7 billion today to at least 8.5 billion. The growth mainly in Africa and India. And to feed this population requires modern agricultural methods, genetic modification probably among them, and modern engineering practices to conserve water, reduce food waste, and so forth. And John Beddington will be talking more about this. And more than 50% of people now live in cities, and this proportion keeps going up. And another trend, of course, is that the world's intellectual and physical capital is shifting to Asia, a trend which signals the end of 400 years of North Atlantic hegemony, as it were. There are good reasons, though, to expect that population growth after 2050 will level off. The number of children being born has actually been more or less level since 2000. But because it was rising steeply till then, of course, most people now living are now young, and they will have children, and they can expect to grow old. Global population seems in the past to have been somewhat under-discussed. And I'm rather glad that when I was President of the Royal Society, I initiated a rather good report chaired by John Sulston on this. I think it's been under-discussed because doom-laden forecasts made in the past proved off the mark, and because it's deemed by some a taboo subject, tainted by association with eugenics in the 20s and 30s, with Indian policies under Indira Gandhi, and more recently with China's effective but hardline one-child policy. But enhanced education and empowerment of women within this decade, which is surely a benign thing in its own right, would clearly reduce fertility rates in the poorest nations and thereby reduce the projected population beyond 2050. And that's surely a good thing, because the higher the post-2050 population gets, the greater will be all pressures on resources, especially if the developing world, where most of the growth will be, narrows its gap with developed world in its per capita consumption of energy and resources. So the world will be more crowded in the second half of the century. We can also confidently predict that it will be warmer, because burning of fossil fuels is pumping more CO2 into the atmosphere. And climate change is a subject which is certainly not under-discussed. The predicted rate of warming, however, is uncertain, depending on the poorly understood feedback from water vapor and clouds. Nevertheless, even the existing uncertain science convinces most experts that the threat of disruptive climate change is serious enough to justify its priority on the agenda. Indeed, for me, it's a small chance of something really bad, rather than the mean IPCC projections, which most strongly should motivate concern. The main downsides of global warming, of course, lie 50 or 100 or more years into the future. And concepts of intergenerational justice then come into play. How should we take into account the rights and interests of future generations compared to our own? What discount rate should we apply? How much must be transferred from the developed to the developing world? What should be the balance between mitigation and adaptation, and so forth? A specific recommendation of the Commission was that in long-term planning, as is involved in this context, a low discount rate, a lower discount rate than the normal economic one, was appropriate. As Nick Stern put it, we should not discriminate against people on the grounds of their date of birth. The welfare of future generations should be valued as highly as our own when we formulate these long-term policies. There is, incidentally, one precedent for long-term altruism, a rather odd one. In discussing the safe disposal of nuclear waste, policymakers talk with a straight face about what might happen more than 10,000 years from now, thereby implicitly implying a zero discount rate. Well, to concern ourselves with such a remote post-human era might seem bizarre, but all of us can surely empathize at least a century ahead, especially in Europe, we're mindful of the heritage we owe to centuries past, and history will judge us harshly if we discount too heavily what will happen when our grandchildren grow old. Many of us still hope that our civilization can segue towards a low-carbon future without trauma and disaster. But that will need determined and concerted action by governments urgently implemented. And governments, we believe, must be supplemented by action at the level of cities and large corporations. That was another recommendation of our committee. But such urgency won't be achieved unless sustained campaigning can transform public attitudes. Politicians won't gain much resonance by advocating unwelcome lifestyle changes today for the benefit of those living in remote parts of the world who are as yet unborn. So that's why the priority for all developed countries should be to implement measures in the short run which actually save money, using energy more efficiently, etc., and to prioritize the development of new clean energy sources, be they wind, tides, biofuels, solar, or advanced nuclear. So, given the gridlock in energy and climate, we believe it's important to harness the cities and the large corporations to try and have more effect on a more local level rather than the Copenhagen type gatherings of nearly 200 countries. Incidentally, if nuclear power is to be expanded, then a beefed up IAEA is surely going to be needed to enforce safety standards and guard against proliferation risks. Well, it's clear what we'd like to see happening regarding climate change, but if we ask what will happen, my honest view is very little will happen in the next 20 years to cut annual CO2 emissions. But 20 years from now, we will know from having a longer time base of data and also from better modeling whether the world is on the steeply rising or the more slowly rising of the trajectories in the IPCC report. If it's on the slowly rising one, people will relax. If it's on the steeply rising one, then there may be pressure for panic measures such as geoengineering. And there again, that raises a new set of governance issues which the Commission addressed and which we need to consider. Well, energy security, food supplies and climate change are the prime long-term threats without enemies, as it were, which confront us, all aggravated by rising populations. But there are other threats. For instance, rapid changes in land use may jeopardize whole ecosystems. The extinction rate is far higher than normal, and as Bob May likes to put it, we are destroying the book of life before we've read it. I've so far focused on vulnerabilities which stem from our collective impact on the planet. The more of us, each consuming more. But there's a new kind of generic threat, something that I've written quite a lot about myself. Advances in technology, hugely beneficial though they could be, render us more vulnerable. For instance, our interconnected world depends on elaborate networks. Electric power grids, air traffic control, international finance, just-in-time delivery, and so forth. Unless these are highly resilient, their manifest benefits could be outweighed by catastrophic, albeit rare, breakdowns cascading through the system. No city could survive long without electric power or the internet. Supermarket shelves will be bare within 2 days if supply chains were disrupted. Pandemics could spread at the speed of jet aircraft, causing maximal havoc in the shambolic but burgeoning megacities of the developing world. Social media could spread psychic contagion, rumors and panic, literally at the speed of light. And incidentally, concern about cyber attacks by criminals or hostile nations is rising sharply, and the Commission recommended also a new body to deal with cyber threats. Advances in genetics, likewise, offer huge potential for medicine and agriculture, but they amplify the risk of bioerror or bioterror. And it's probably worth giving a bit more attention to these extreme risks to decide which are real and which are science fiction, and how to mitigate the real ones. Because if an event is potentially catastrophic, it's worth paying a substantial premium to safeguard or insure against it, or to reduce it, even if it's unlikely, just as we take out fire insurance on our house. In that spirit, these global risks, the potential downsides of advancing technology, should move higher up the political agenda. This is a governance challenge, but one which, in contrast to those that most concern Mo Ibrahim, will become starkest in the most technologically advanced countries. Some trends, like I've mentioned, climate and population, can be predicted decades ahead, but technological ones can't. The iPhone would have seemed magic even 20 years ago. So we should keep our minds open, or at least ajar, when we look 50 years ahead, to scenarios that now seem on a speculative fringe. Flaky futurologists aren't always wrong. Before long, for instance, new cognition-enhancing drugs, genetics or cyborg techniques may alter human beings themselves. Maybe Kasparov is going to tell us about this in the talk later today. And the impact of robotics on industry, health and employment is something which the Commission realises are very important to study. But in summary, I think we would all agree that there's no scientific impediment to achieving a sustainable world beyond 2050, with 9 billion people or more, where the developing countries have narrowed the gap with the developed ones, and all benefit from further advances which could have as great and benign an impact as information technology has had in the last decade. But the intractable politics and sociology, the gap between potentialities and what actually happens, engenders pessimism. Will richer countries recognise that it's in their interest for the developing world to prosper and to share fully in the benefits of globalization? Will there be employment opportunities worldwide for the next generation at different levels of skill? Can nations sustain effective but non-repressive governance in the face of threats from small groups with high-tech expertise? And above all, can our institutions prioritise projects that are long-term in a political perspective, even if a mere instant in the history of our planet? The report, entitled Now for the Long Term, presents a practical agenda designed to overcome the gap between knowledge and effective action. And institutions play a role here. The UN, the World Bank, WHO and so forth were visionary ideas when they were first proposed 60 or so years ago. But perhaps new or different ones are needed to address the new challenges. And there were some interesting ideas on this in an earlier seminar on this series by Professor Kenny, which I watched on the internet. I think, apart from formal organizations like UN agencies, the scientific community can do its bit. And here I include the social sciences, of course. The social sciences and the natural sciences, of course, have information and knowledge, which is going to be crucial, although not in itself sufficient, in assuring a better world. But also the communities of people in those fields are more broadly international than any others. Even in the depth of the Cold War, there were links between physicists in the Soviet Union and North America and Europe. So the scientific community collectively does indeed have a role to play. And the stronger it can be, academies, etc., the better. But all of us as individuals can do our bit. And we can do more, I think, as individuals in the present role of social media, blogs, etc. We can be inspired by individual scientists in the past who've campaigned as global citizens. For instance, after World War II, atomic scientists like Hans Bethe, Rudy Piles and Joe Rotblat dedicated intense efforts towards taming the nuclear powers they'd helped unleash. And there are present-day counterparts of those people. For instance, John Sulston, who in the 1990s led the UK part of the Human Genome Project, campaigns to provide affordable drugs for Africa. The great ecologist E.O. Wilson argues eloquently for the preservation of biodiversity. And of course, many lesser-known figures are active in NGOs and government agencies and in global organizations like the WHO and the IPCC. So, as well as needing perhaps new organizations, we need more activism by individual scientists acting as citizens. And as I said, through social media, they now have more opportunities than in the past. And it's gratifying, though of course unsurprising, that those in a younger generation, some of whom may still be alive at the end of a century, take a more global perspective and are more concerned with these long-term environmental issues. And it should, of course, be a goal of educators, like those of us in universities, to stimulate such attitudes and commitments. There's a current slogan, "We're all in this together." You may be cynical about the way this slogan is used now, but be it as it may, we are surely all on this crowded earth together. And we need, as citizens, better governance and a perspective broader in both space and time if we're to safeguard the welfare of future generations, to benefit from new technology but avoid its nightmarish downsides. We need not only good intentions, but wide-ranging expertise, and that's why the Martin School is a particularly valuable exemplar for all of academia. I'll finish by one of my favourite quotes from one of Britain's wisest scientists, the late Peter Medawar. I quote, "The bells that toll for mankind are like the bells of alpine cattle. They're attached to our own necks, and it must be our fault if they do not make a tuneful and melodious sound." Thank you very much.
Well, in one way, it's enormously gratifying to have Lord Rees be, as he put it, my warm-up act. On the other hand, you have an issue to actually follow that. So, Martin, thank you very much. The title here is sort of slightly mischievous. I was not involved in the Oxford Martin Commission except towards the end, where I was involved in actually trying to help focus some of the thinking. But actually, I can free confession. The long term interests me less than the short term. When one is looking at a lot of the literature on climate change and so on, people are worried about 2050. I'll be 105 in 2050, and I have to say that it seems less immediate to me than it might be for those who are rather younger in this audience. And so I'm going to focus in my talk this afternoon is some of the things that I really feel there should be a much greater sense of urgency than there has been. So let me jump into it. And first of all, let me just look to one of the slides that was reproduced in the Martin Commission report, which actually comes from some work I did. And I won't go into the history, but when I took over the job as the chief scientist in 2008, we saw for the first time a reversal of the changes and real declines in world food prices. They've been declining for 4 decades. And in 2007, for the first time, there was an increase in food prices. And it started me thinking, well, I started to think about some of the issues that were actually involved with this, and this slide does it. But let me go to the more detailed slide. Because the issues are to do with what I characterized as a perfect storm. The idea that we're going to need by 2030, when I will only be 85, the acute amongst you will have already done the arithmetic, you're going to need of the order of 50% more food, 40% more water, 40% more energy, and so on. But the key drivers, which I'm going to go into there, now this afternoon, there are 4. There's an increasing population, which Martin's alluded to all of these, the increasing levels of urbanisation, the fact that there's a good but a dilemma posed by alleviating poverty to some extent, and then you've got this complicating issue of climate change. I'm going to go through those initially. Let me just talk to population. Now, in a sense, albeit the world is uncertain, demography has a certain inexorable characteristic. By and large, we know that by 2025, 12 years away, there's going to be another 1 billion people on the planet compared with a couple of years ago. That might happen a little bit earlier than 2025, might be 2024 in November, or it might be early 2026, but that's pretty much what's going to happen. And it's divided unequally, that population increase, primarily between Africa and Asia, and Africa and pretty much half. So that extra 1 billion people, 500 million additional Africans, 500 million additional Asians. But in Africa, it will be dramatic because the current population in Africa is about 1 billion. So the population in Africa is going to go up by 50%. Remember, 12 years. The same will Asia, but Asia's got a population of in excess of 4 billion, so it'll go up from 4 billion to 4.5. So that's, and as you can see from the graph, essentially every other major region of the world is pretty much stagnant. So that's where there's going to be enormous change in the next decade or 2. The second change that is happening is urbanisation. And this is dramatic. 2007, I think, 9, was the first year that the urban population exceeded the rural, and as the top right-hand graph shows, the expectation is that the urban population of the world will continue to grow, and indeed the rural population is expected to decline. The box points to the issue in terms of developing countries, something of the order of 1 million people every 5 days will need a city. Giving it in a parochial context, take Africa. What you're talking about, the expectation in Africa is you'll have cities of urban conglomerations of about 500,000 people. Put that in a context, 1,000 cities the size of Edinburgh in 12 years. That's the sort of statistic that I find virtually incomprehensible. And there's complications, demography is complicated, and I've already alluded to my advanced years, but I'm not going to be alone, because there, as you can see from the bottom right graph, vast numbers of the world's population, particularly in the developing world, are going to be living much longer. Clearly a good thing. So those are things that are happening. But urbanisation is going to be problematic, and this shows the predictions of where urban agglomerations are going to be occurring just 12 years hence. And I think, as you can see, the red dots are proportional to size of the agglomeration. An awful lot around around the coast. Very, very significant development, coastal development expected. And of course that will be vulnerable, and I'll come on to it in a little while, the issues of climate change. So those are two of these drivers, and they're not going to go away. This is happening. You know, there may be minor changes, but that is definitely what is happening. And then there's something that is actually a tremendous good. This is a slide from the Martin Commission report. On the left-hand side shows, and the circles are proportional to the number of people in poverty. And there's been enormous achievement here. You know, in the 10 years here, this obviously 2015's prediction, but this is not going to be about right, you're seeing a very, very big change in the number of people who would be considered to be in abject poverty, insufficient calories for physical and mental growth, basically. So a big achievement there, and you can see some of the major countries are marked, big changes that have actually occurred. Now, that is to hide something which I'm involved in recently, major hidden hunger or malnutrition, enough diet to provide enough calories, but not enough for the quality of food to actually have proper development. So there's a problem there which I won't allude to. So things are actually improving, you know. The world, there are fewer of the abject poor. Paul Collier, our colleague here, wrote this excellent book on the bottom billion. There's a few less than that now in the terms of improvement, but it's there. And indeed, the prosperity of the world, and the Martin Commission pointed to this, this shows the sort of expectation of what we might loosely term the middle classes in the developing world. And the prediction of how those middle classes is likely to increase, coming from globalization and other mechanisms, where economic growth has produced more people who are actually able to be roughly classified as middle class. And to give you gross figures, currently in the developing world there's about 1 billion people who would be classified as middle class and having a sufficient purchasing power. That's increasing by 100 million a year. So the number of people who actually have the purchasing power of what we might loosely call middle class is going to double within the next 10 years, from 1 billion to 2 billion. So big issues. But this movement out of poverty and the movement to prosperity is of course an enormously good thing, but it poses a dilemma. Because if people move out of poverty, their demand for the goods and services, and I've just shown it for energy and generalized food and change in pattern of diet here, increases. The bottom, you know, the x-axis is GDP per capita, and energy is a sort of slightly noisy style, but the slope is pretty clear. And my colleague David Mackay, who is Chief Scientist in the Department of Energy and Climate Change, pulled that together. But others are showing so. The dilemma is that we're going, as we pull people out of poverty, consumption means the demand for natural resources increases. To summarize this briefly, if you look at the top left-hand slide, that's the demand for energy as you extrapolate into the future. The blue is the OECD, so pretty much nothing. massive increases in the demand for energy occurring in the developing world. If you go to water, what it's showing is, one looks out 15 or 20 years, that there is about a deficit of about 40% in available fresh water. This is the one that really frightens me also, because you're going to need to be thinking about how's that addressed. And food, which is an area I work fairly well in, big increases in the productivity of food. I've shown the increases in yield in kilograms per hectare, tons per hectare, for two typical major cereals. And you can see just by extrapolating that growth that's happened, if we're going to meet the demands of food, we're going to hit the real issue of can we actually increase that yield? Can we get it? Because there is a lot of association, I don't have time this afternoon to talk about it, there's a lot of association of increase in food prices and the breakdown of civil order. Now, climate change. There's a lot of debate about climate change, particularly in parts of the press. The other Lawson, not the one who is rather on the front pages of our newspapers in today, but the father is a well-known skeptic. Let me just point to a few things. This is a map of the world, come from many, many millions of observations, taken in 3 decades, from 55, 65 and 75. The red shows a deviation from the average, red saying it's got a bit hotter. And those are the 3 decades, 55, 65 and 75. And emphasize again, this isn't modelling, this is not somebody sat in front of a computer terminal with no reality check. That's those 3 decades. This is the last 6 years. And the contrast between the deviations that you were seeing 3 decades ago and what you're seeing in the last 6 years, I believe is completely startling. So the idea that, and again, it's not modelling, this is data, this is people collecting observations, millions of them around the world. That is happening. Don't believe anything that says it's not. Now, one of the things that is raised against, and I started life as an academic before I became a civil servant. One of the things that critics of climate change say is, oh, for heaven's sake, climate change is so boring, it's just academics doing it to get promotion or get better grant money and so on, and get elected as fellows of the Royal Society by drawing attention to these things, saying, isn't it terrible? And, you know, knowing the academic world a bit like that way, there arguably might be some truth in it. So one of the things that is interesting to go to is actually looking at the business community. And the bottom graph, histogram there, comes from Munich Re, the largest reinsurance company in the world, hard-bitten people. And they've classified disasters according to the red, which are geophysical ones, earthquakes, volcanoes, tsunamis, and those that are climate-related. And I think, whereas I wouldn't hang my hat on the graph the actual pattern of increase of the line there, but it is happening. And again, the business community understands that and gets it, as indeed does the scientific community, and I hope increasingly the general public. What's the implications of that is that we're going to actually see vastly more variability. Severe weather events are going to be. Hurricane Sandy, we've just seen one in the Philippines, devastating loss of life. The one in Burma, some 5 or 6 years ago, killed of the order of 250,000 people. We're going to see this more extreme, and it has got implications everywhere. We're going to see changes, and we're going to see increasing variation. And one of the things that is really important to understand about climate change is that it comes with a time lag. So the weather we're currently experiencing is driven by a climate which is determined by the greenhouse gases in the upper atmosphere in the 1990s. So 20-year time delay, that's the sort of weather we're being delivered. That's being produced by those greenhouse gases. And of course, since 1990, not been much of a slowdown in the accumulation of greenhouse gases. So with that 20-year time lag, what we're experiencing in 2013 will be determining climate and therefore our weather out to the 2030s and beyond. And the climate change negotiations, Martin referred to them, haven't been that successful. The Copenhagen round, and I remember I was new in government in those days, and the subsequent meetings in Cancun and Doha, and the one that is actually just completed in Poland, they're not working. you're not getting an international consensus to do things like that. And actually, I'm afraid, now I'm out of government, I can actually say things like this. I don't think there's a hope. Let me just show a couple of reasons why I think it's really problematic. This is not from the climate change meetings, but this is the Rio summits. There was one a year and a half ago. This is the number of states that are involved, which is increasing. And this is the number of citizens groups or NGOs who are involved. These meetings are ginormous. They are, you know, I hate to think of the greenhouse gas footprint that are produced by these sort of meetings, but they are enormous. And you don't get complex agreements agreed by a discussion between 180 parties. I cannot see it happening. So I think the Commission's suggestion when simplifying in alliances, I think is excellent. And the other thing we have to recognise is the geopolitical situation is changing. Half the world lives in that circle. You've got to get agreement of half the world's population to get any movement on issues like this. And that's going to be difficult, to say the least. So moving on into the challenges up to 2030, just to sort of summarise, these are the issues. You've got 1 billion more people or so. Urbanisation is dramatic. We're looking at problems of complex demographic trends, an increasingly elderly population in many parts of the world, migration and climate change as a multiplier. So that's, as it were, the challenges up to 2030. Now, if that didn't cheer you up enough, I'd just like to say I want to now really focus on the short term. I could, in the first version of this talk, I would then say, well, what's happening out to 2050? And Martin has covered that very well. It's just going to be more of the same, very, very difficult, and particularly in demography. Unless you get a slowdown in female fertility, you are going to see not a population of 9 or 10 billion towards the end, the middle to the last half of the 20th century. It's going to be 2 billion more than that. It is female fertility that controls it. And one of the problems about it, and Martin again alluded to it, and I think this is one of the most difficult, is that we know that education, prosperity, and the availability of contraception are the 3 determinants of female fertility. Not clear that those are changing dramatically quickly, or will change adjustingly. But let me move now to the short term. Now, the government has a thing called the National Risk Register. It classifies disasters. It looks out 5 years ahead, and it says, what's the likelihood of something happening, and what's its impact? And I've circled a few of those. Pandemic influenza is the one with the highest likelihood and the highest impact. Space weather, which you may not be so familiar with, and some of the issues that are occurring. I've focused on volcanoes, which you'll be familiar with, of the disasters we had in the south, in the northeast Atlantic, and flooding, and rather topical as we expect a storm surge in the North Sea sometime in the next 24 hours. So this is the National Risk Register. Let me go very quickly through a few of these. Pandemics. This slide shows you the increase in animal and human diseases over the last 5 decades or so. And there are others. My slide stops in 2012, and one could extend it. But you can see an enormous frequency of new diseases coming in. And the one that one worries about, of course, is some form of pandemic associated with the flu virus. And to give you a flavour for why we're worried about that, swine flu, which you'll all remember, killed about the mortality rate was about 0.001. So a tiny proportion of people died from getting this virus. In the bird flu, where you do get a transition from birds to humans, though not human-to-human transmission, 60% die, not 0.0001%, 60% people who get bird flu die. So a pandemic like that, if it comes, would completely transform our society. And Martin again alluded to it, the top little right-hand graph shows how quickly diseases will go around the world. The first outbreak of swine flu in Mexico was in April. By this middle of May, it was in 80 countries. Just a month. Sort of thing that we've got to recognise, and a very good predictor of actually saying what's happening is where aircraft fly. So that is one that worries us. Then space weather. This is another cheering thing, and actually I'm glad to say it didn't happen. But the sun, we really don't control the sun. I think pretty difficult to even imagine that we would. But periodically you get major sort of disturbance coming from the sun. One of the ones is the coronal mass emissions, and the little sub-slide there was just a year and a half ago, in which we actually did have a major solar flare going towards the Earth. Actually it hit us a glancing blow. But it has the potential, because of our vulnerability, to actually wipe out much of our satellite communication and actually our grid. Because if you get a particular magnetic orientation of the coronal mass emission when it hits the Earth, it can actually blow the grid. There's quite an entertaining story, and I don't think I'm actually breaking official secrets, but we've got about a 17-hour prediction that there's a coronal mass emission coming towards the Earth. 17 hours, well, you can do things in that. The thing is that to affect the grid, you've got to have a particular magnetic orientation, and you have a 40 minutes prediction on that. So if you can imagine, as my successor, Mr. Mark Walpert, is having to talk to the Prime Minister and say, well, Prime Minister, there's a coronal mass emission coming towards the Earth, it will almost certainly hit, we can predict that, and the Prime Minister says, well, should I worry? And he said, well, if the magnetic orientation is this way, it'll blow our entire grid. And he says, well, when will I know? And he said, well, about 40 minutes before it happens. I do not envy him that conversation. Let me move on to a few others. I am terribly pessimistic about reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And the dramatic picture here is, why have I circled the Bakken Formation in North Dakota? This is light. This picture taken by NASA at night, showing the eastern seaboard, and you can see the major urban conglomerations on the eastern seaboard, and this is light coming out from those. The Bakken Formation is the major shale gas and shale oil area in the central northern USA. That light is coming from burning waste gas. The gas prices have dropped so much in the USA with the development of shale gas that it is now a waste product. It gives you a flavour for the amount of energy that is being wasted as they burn and the scale of it. And there's two other things that worry me and why I'm very pessimistic about how we will actually deal with climate change. And I agree with Martin, I don't think we'll see much. This first one is an ironic one. Climate change already is producing big changes in the Arctic with a big reduction in the sea ice, and that means that the Arctic is therefore accessible in a way that it never has been, and it's becoming accessible for the exploitation of hydrocarbons. And the final one is the coal reserves in the world. The dark blue indicates there's a lot. The pale blue means there's quite a lot. Virtually impossible to imagine that you're not going to see these coal reserves used, and they are dramatically large. And coal, big producer of greenhouse gas emissions, very, very worrying, and I think will happen. Hard to see how that imagined. So we need to be thinking about interventions, particularly in terms of the sequestration of carbon dioxide, which may help. And my final one is a way to use lies, damn lies, and statistics. This is to do with the ocean acidification. And the top graph shows you how you can make a dramatic effect look really dramatic if you have your x-axis in millions of years. You pretty much guarantee that you fall off a cliff at this stage, but there's a serious issue here. What it's saying is that the oceans are more acidic now than they have been for of the order of 20 million years. Big effects on marine ecosystems, big effects on obviously things like coral reefs and so on. And the problem is that this one is something that's just going to happen. It's not going to be reversed over a time scale of even several hundred years, even if we stop greenhouse gas emissions now. Because it's simple for chemistry. The mixing of seawater with carbon dioxide produces an acid. and the oceans are getting more and more acidic. So that's not reversible. So to end on this cheerful little ditty, I'm saying that absolutely the Martin Commission is right to address these problems and to think how they are. And I suppose if I have had a plea with you this afternoon, it's to say, don't relax, you know, something for the long term. It's going to hit you quite quickly, and we do need to be thinking a way governments can react, and the international community to react to mitigate some of these very, very important issues. And because I was chief scientist, I'm still a passionate advocate of science and engineering as solving the world's problems. That's why I really think that it is so important that we actually encourage that work to try and solve these problems. So thank you for your attention.
So thank you so much, Lord Rees and Sir John Beddington, for really tremendously impassioned and scientifically based focus on the things that we've discussed in the Oxford Martin Commission for Future Generations, and actually the reason we exist as the Oxford Martin School, because we exist to deal with these sorts of questions. But I hope it's not only awakened your very strong passions, but also your interests, and we have some opportunity now to engage in a conversation with Lord Rees and Sir John. I'm afraid we don't yet have our stage here. You know, this building has only very recently been commissioned, so they're at your eye level. So perhaps stand up when you ask a question so they can see where you are. I'm going to start with the microphone in the back, so do put up your hands if you have particular questions, and we'll come forward. Yeah, the woman over there on the right.
Hello. Given that you're both so pessimistic about what we're going to do about CO2 emissions and various other things, mainly CO2 I think you mentioned, for the next 20 years, if you don't think there is going to be much movement in the next 20 years, what can we be doing now to plan for the fact that you don't think there's going to be much movement? And are we doing enough?
Yes. Well, I mean, although I'm pessimistic about what will happen, let me say we should not ease up on our efforts to ensure that things are done. We should try even harder because we are up against this resistance. I mean, I think just two things. First, obviously, as I mentioned, there are some things that can be done which actually benefit people in the short run. Better insulation of buildings, pushing for clean energy. And I think the clean energy agenda deserves a high priority like the Manhattan Project, because we aren't putting enough R&D into it, and I can't think of anything that would enthuse young people more about engineering than the challenge of trying to provide clean energy for the world. So we should go for reducing energy inefficiency and developing clean energy. Also, there's something else I think we can do. The trouble is that the consequence of CO2 is very diffuse and very delayed. But of course, there are the minor constituents of the atmosphere which contribute to global warming, which also have more local effects on pollution, etc. And I think one can perhaps focus cities, certainly in China, on efforts to reduce the output of other gases which not only contribute to global warming, but also have other more obvious and local downsides. So I think to focus on the non-CO2 global warming agents might be more easy to enthuse the public about.
I think I'd add to that that we in a sense we need to act while expecting the worst. So I think that there needs to be investments in time thinking about adaptation to what climate change will occur. Martin has made the good point that there's a lot of things that can actually be done in terms of improving the carbon footprint of the way in which we actually use energy. And of course, those things are there. We also need to be thinking about mechanisms, and here engineering will come in on a grand scale, of actually getting rid of carbon dioxide. For example, there's some development in the agricultural world in which we've suggested that we need to be thinking about an agricultural practice which is climate smart. That is, the actual agricultural practice involves the sequestration of carbon dioxide into the soil. And there's some very smart things that you can do there. For example, one can have mixes of planting conventional crops, but with trees alongside, and that actually both increases the yield because it provides protection and sequesters carbon dioxide. And I think the other area that we've got to think about more seriously, though it is really quite controversial, is the idea that we can actually directly intervene in the climate by actually thinking about ways in which we can sequester carbon dioxide or indeed lower levels of incident light. And there is a Martin School program on geoengineering, a lot of interest in geoengineering, but it is difficult because the models that we have are really quite awkward. So we might have the ability, for example, to put aerosol gases, probably water actually, driven up into the Atlantic. But we would hate to predict quite what that happen. You might suddenly, it might actually generate a large desert in central Brazil. And so you tread in these interventions rather carefully. But I would echo Martin's sentiment, is don't give up. I may be 105 and not care, but looking at you will not be 105. And we've got to make it work. And I would also be quite positive. I think that we underestimate human ingenuity at our peril. I think there is an awful lot of smart things that are happening, and I agree with Martin. We need much bigger investment.
Okay. We have quite a few hands. The gentleman there, yeah.
Thank you. So let me try the optimistic side of that question. So in the commission, there's this suggestion of forming C20, C30, C40, sort of coalitions, various public and private groups, in order to have fora for communication. And I was wondering, let's suppose that we were able to form these sorts of groups. What sort of pathways do you see that they would be able to exert influence on an international stage? Is there ways you could see of them doing this? Thanks.
Yes.
I perhaps respond to that as I was quite involved in that particular suggestion. I think there's a number of things to be said. First is that one's not necessarily going to want to wait for all countries to agree something, and actually one doesn't need to, because a group of 20 countries account for something like 80% of global emissions. So there's actually no need to get all countries on board. What you need to ensure is legitimacy. The second point is that even in very big countries, which are very significant, like the USA, actually, if you mobilize critical cities and states, you could achieve something like 80% of what could be achieved through federal government action. So there's various ways, and this has been demonstrated in other areas, where you don't have to rely on the monopoly of governments in order to effect action. And if you wait for the monopoly of international governance, you might wait for far too long. This is obviously true in the corporate world as well, where they're leading businesses who are doing extraordinary things in many, many areas. So looking to them, and then looking to a group of countries that are prepared to move. The European Union has said many times it's prepared to move on certain issues. Indeed, it did impose a carbon tax. China has now indicated it would move in many areas. So one idea was the G20, although Australia is head of the G20 next. That's unlikely to be a leadership group under Australia on climate change, but one could imagine a different constellation of 20 countries. So there's to move agendas as quickly as possible without waiting for the laggards to slow the whole process up. Create virtuous circles, demonstrate that you can actually make a difference, build courage in the system, build conviction in the system, and then widen these circles as you go forward. So that's the basic idea behind that. So Crispin here.
I just wanted to raise a point that both of you have touched upon, but it's one of those points which cause people embarrassment, like population increase. And that is how we measure things. If you look at the kind of statements made by politicians, and indeed some scientists the world over, you hear the talk always about a kind of conflict between environment and economic growth. Now, one thing is obvious, is that we need to change our estimates and way of calculating economic growth. And it's quite interesting that I don't know whether that appears in your report. I've only been able to see a summary of it. For that reason, I don't know if you tackled it. But I would like to see some new way of trying to measure what you mean by economic growth, whether you include in it externalities, whether it isn't just the sort of vulgar sense of producing more things, some of them quite useless. All that means that if we could get better definitions of economic growth, and some people have already been trying to do so, we would have a much more accurate idea of what is really going on and how we're going to cope with the majestic problems that both our speakers have spoken about today.
Well, you're the economist, Ian. You probably ought to answer that.
I don't want to answer all the questions. Why don't you bring that mic forward? The Commission had one specific proposal on this, which is to move away from a focus on average per capita incomes to median, which makes a very big difference because it gives you the distribution, for example, of inequality behind it, and to part of the WorldStat idea, which Martin Rees referred to, is also about this. So absolutely, the question of what one means by economic growth is absolutely central. Whether you need more economic growth, particularly once you've escaped poverty and live in relative well-being, and what the implications for other are of that, and of course all the natural capital and biodiversity and other conversations. Do you want to?
Just a comment, obviously the indices of welfare should contain non-economic factors like health and life expectancy, etc. But also it is important, as you imply, to put in as a negative contribution to GNP the depletion of exhaustible resources and the biosphere. And I know my Cambridge colleague Partha Gupta has done quite a lot on this. He's even got this to be included in the Indian national accounts. So this sort of approach, I think, is going to make people sensitive, at least, to the issue that we are not improving our welfare very much if we deplete the natural resources.
Yes, Elizabeth Roberts. So, John, you mentioned that there was one of the very serious measurements was a 40% deficit in water, in water resources. And I know that water resources are heavily used in things like the production of biofuels and also in techniques like fracking and in large-scale intensive agricultural production. And it occurs to me that would there be, what value might there be in some sort of alternative measurement of the use of countries of their virtual water imprint in place of a carbon imprint, but perhaps this might galvanize populations and might be a very useful way of looking at resources deficiencies in the future.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think just to give the scale of the problem, you know, something of the order of 70% of all water used is used for agriculture, and in the developing world, it's about 85%. The effect of being, for example, with well-meaning interventions by government, have been dire. So northwest India, the water that is being used for irrigation is typically about 300 years old. So it gives you an idea of how sustainable that is. But I think that we do need to be thinking much harder about water, and in a sense, a consumer sense. We're all fairly familiar, for example, with you know, air miles and so on associated with the import of particular products, and we are actually looking to see packaging which reflects it. But the reality of it is, of course, is that there is, you know, we do need to be thinking very hard about what is the water footprint of particular products. You know, like cotton tends to be grown in countries where there is a significant water shortage, and it's coming to this country, or the OECD more generally, and with an enormous water footprint. And I think that is probably going to becoming more natural parlance, particularly in the major retailers and so on, where water footprint is going to be there. I also think we need to have a way of addressing how better to manage water, because it is, in many parts of the world, it's a free resource, so a free good, and there's no, therefore, easy way of actually distributing it in an appropriate way. But also, I think that we need to be thinking rather hard about the sort of common property aspects of water. And there's an interesting program that's developed at Oxford, led by Jim Hall, which is actually looking at how better one might actually manage water resources. But it's it's a big problem. And it's going to get, and there's interesting interventions that one can ponder. For example, reservoirs. Why on earth do we have reservoirs above ground where evaporation occurs? Why don't we think about alternative reservoirs which are underground? Indeed, the Chinese are building many of them as some of their tropical glaciers are melting. So I think there's a lot of intervention. Africa is really intriguing here because I think this has a potential. The British Geological Survey and others have found very, very substantial subsurface deposits of water in Africa. Enough probably to actually provide water for this burgeoning urban population. But actually it's in the wrong place, it's sub-Saharan and so on. So needing to think about ways that you can actually transport and then manage water is really very high priority. It's actually one of the really nice things about the coming to Oxford and being involved in activities. Most of these problems that we've identified have got some form of program working on them. Whether they're going to solve it is a different matter, but at least somebody's putting some effort into it.
Do you want to add? Yeah.
My name is John Moore. I'll be 109.
Hang on. Sorry, take the microphone.
Thanks. My name is John Moore. I'll be 109 in 2050. I like to go back 66 years ago to 1947 when America brought the Marshall Plan to Europe. I like to propose a new Marshall Plan called an Energy Marshall Plan based primarily on energy efficiency, which is the low-hanging fruit. My company is working on a program to take half the heating oil and LPG trucks off the road to reduce carbon emissions and reduce cost.
Thank you. Yeah, I was aware, John, of your company's operation. I think there are many of the interventions that one can think like that. One of the things that is really sort of intriguing, and Lady Roberts referred to the issue of fracking, for example, which does use one heck of a lot of water. Depends where it is, really. And I think I think that there is going to have to be much more attention drawn to water, not just in the countries where this is a major shortage now, but in to be thinking about more efficient usage. And John, your company is obviously doing some interesting stuff in this area.
The other interesting water issue is distillation of seawater, which is basically the energy price, which is now much cheaper than bottled water. So how that plays into this triangle that you put up of the perfect storm, I think would be very important. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. You have said some interesting things, I think, about the measurement of economic growth and all this, and about water. That was but there's something that really worries me. There are two kind of ideas going on here which are actually totally contradictory. One is this idea that, you know, we're going to try for sustainability, and the other is that we're going to have all this wonderful material security and a growing middle class, and they're going to have all these wonderful things. We've already said that if everybody had the average US income, we'd need about 4 planets to provide this. There just aren't enough resources. And the other thing that you haven't mentioned about at all is pollution. It's not just acidification of the seas that's happening. We just had a headline about how walruses, I think, or sea lions have now got cancer thanks to pollution of the seas. And all around, we're terribly aware of this danger of pollution, not least the other thing is Sellafield. There are kind of too much plutonium now sitting there, and they don't know what to do with it. They're talking about burning it. Oh, well, that'd be fun to have a lot of burnt plutonium. And I just think that the capitalism needs growth. You know, that's what they want. They want these increased markets because that's how capitalism works. It has to be continually growing, and producing useless things. So we've got Cameron running around, I'm nearly finished, to China, you know, increasing trade with China. That's really going to help. All that CO2 transport to and fro, you know. And then the other thing, he's saying, oh yes, and we've got Osborne, we've got growth. But what kind of growth have we got? You know, we haven't really got growth of things that people actually need.
I'd like to pass to Martin on this, but I just make an observation. Yes. It is very nice to say, let's restrict growth, let's restrict prosperity, viewed from Oxford. If you view it from Karnataka, or you view it from the sort of slums of the Philippines, or the slums of things, you have a very different perception, because there's a reasonable aspiration for people to get wealthier.
Yes.
But there's enough
Over
for
to you.
everybody's need, but not for everybody's greed. And at the
Yes,
moment, we've got everybody trying to be greedy.
Slogans are good.
And not
Yes.
satisfying. just
Can I,
me.
can I,
Martin, go
I
ahead.
have to say two cheerful things, or relatively. First, regarding pollution, I think there are many examples, not least in this country, where pollution has been reduced as industries become more developed. I mean, pea soup fogs and all that. So one can't assume that pollution is going to get worse. One hopes the Chinese will follow the example which we took in London 50 years ago and reduce their pollution. So I think there's hope of reducing pollution. But on a more general point, I mean, I'm not an economist, but I think you're quite right, obviously, in saying that we can't have everyone in the world ever living like present-day Americans. The world could only support 1 or 2 billion people if they were all going to live like that. But economic growth doesn't require us to follow that same track. Economic growth in the last 10 or 20 years has been fueled by information technology, the internet and miniaturization and things of that kind, which have hugely benefited everyone's welfare, but they don't, except in the case of some rare metals, provide any constraints or any severe demands on resources. So I think it's possible to have a kind of economic development which is genuine growth, genuine increase in welfare, which is environmentally benign. And I would cite miniaturization and the internet and things like that, which actually reduce the need for raw materials, reduce the need for travel, and we want them to spread through the world, and certainly not people to behave like present-day Americans.
Gentlemen.
Thank you. Robin Tucker. Most of the actions to improve things, I think, come ultimately from some kind of public policy decision, whether they be public sector actions or business actions or individual actions. So I have two linked questions. One is, how can we help governments to shift towards a longer term thinking? Having worked in the private sector, I've seen it vary from the next election to shorter periods, like the next hour. The second question is, Britain is a small country in a big world, but can it usefully set an example, or is there another role that Britain could play?
Well, maybe I could answer the second question, which is really taking the moral high ground is quite expensive on your population. I don't think we should ignore that, but we clearly ought to do it. You know, the fact that, you know, the UK has one of the few countries that actually has a formal pledge, which is a law, to reduce our emissions by 80% by 2050. And that was cross-party support some 12 years ago. And that is actually what we're working towards. And so I think that is important. Now, the fact that it is about the same, that will have the effect as sort of about a fifth of the Pearl River urban conglomeration compared with total emissions, is true, but not relevant. I think we've got to see some degree of leadership. But I'll let Martin answer the first question.
Well, the first question was public attitudes. Was it for the long term? Yes.
And how to shift government attitudes
Yes.
more of the long term?
Yes. Well, I mean, I think, first of all, academics talking directly to government doesn't have very much effect. Academics talking to the press, and the press then making a lot of hype about those causes, does have an effect on politicians. So I think that's why outreach to the wider public is very important, and we can thereby have an indirect effect, which is greater than direct effect. I think we shouldn't be too pessimistic about changes in wider social attitudes. If one thinks about the change in attitudes to drink driving and many other things over the last 30 or 40 years, it's not impossible to imagine that it might become regarded as sort of naff to drive your 4x4 and be extravagant and change social attitudes in those benign directions. And of course, politicians will respond to changed attitudes. So I think we've got to get through to the public and to the politicians via the public, rather than just directly as experts.
Daniel West. I was intrigued by the fact that past actions are now directly determining the present. Are there any parallels in human history at a comparable timescale, either globally or for specific societies?
I'm really sorry, I just didn't pick up that question. Do you mind repeating it? I'm
Sure,
sorry.
that's fine. Okay, so I was intrigued by the fact that past actions are now determining the present. are there any parallels in human history at a comparable timescale? And this is either globally or for specific societies.
Martin.
Well, I suspect there aren't, because we've never had an interconnected world to the same extent as now. So there have been regional catastrophes, regional pandemics, etc., but they haven't been global. And also, since the world population was, it was 3 billion 50 years ago and lower in the 19th century, the overall impact of humans has never been so great now. I think it's now the case that 40% of biomass is indirectly or directly used by humans. That certainly wasn't the case 100 years ago. So I suspect that, as I said at the beginning of my remarks, this century is special. It's the first one where human beings collectively are having an impact on the biosphere, because there are more of us, and we are in an interconnected world where we can't just have local crises without becoming global.
Well, I think historically the studies that have been done that I'm aware of are actually usually for small island communities, where in a sense resources are quite limited, and sort of Jared Diamond's book on highlights this for a number of societies. The one I remember particularly is Easter Island, where in fact the development of the population and the effect that of over-exploitation of their natural resources led to essentially the extinction of the entire population there. Now, extrapolating from Easter Island to the whole of the globe is pretty courageous, but I think that there are parallels. But I think that it is an interesting question, because one needs to be pondering whether in fact sensible focusing studies, could we learn from studies of societies that have actually collapsed on the basis of changing climate. And the desertification is obviously one of the areas that's happened, but how have they coped and why have they collapsed, and which have been successful? Interesting study, very interesting idea. I don't know that anything much has been done on it.
Yeah. Just in terms of the Oxford Martin Commission on this, just a couple of thoughts. One is that the second part, the middle of the report, tries to focus on lessons learned. What's worked and what hasn't worked in terms of changes, and why did some things happen and others not. So I'd encourage you to look at that. The other point we make in the Commission, which I think is true, is that this is the first time, not only when we're able to have dramatic impact across the world because of this hyperconnectivity, what I call the butterfly defect, but also it's the first time where we can really look forward. As we know the implications of our actions for generations to come. And that's reasonably new, I think, and puts a special responsibility on us for that reason. Okay, let's just see a show of hands. We've got about 10 minutes. Got a few hands up. Yeah, yeah, okay. Let's start here and just go back. I think we'll collect the questions, I think, and come back.
I would like to ask both speakers and the chairman, do you think that the causes or the reasons for short-term thinking or the failure to think long-term lie more at the individual level, a failure of, say, values, moral values, or do you think it lies at the institutional level? So, for example, if we tinkered with the electoral system, we might be able to encourage more long-term thinking.
Well, I think the answer is
we're going to collect a few questions.
Well, I hope you're going to remember them, because I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to.
Right, I'll just take two then. All right. The woman on the right there.
Hello. So I'm sure you've been following what happened in Poland just extremely recently. And I think the Philippine disaster highlighted this extremely well, that, you know, the costs of global warming are not evenly distributed alongside the contribution to global warming. And in fact, they're almost exactly, you know, sort of flipped. So I was wondering, do you think I was wondering what you thought of the idea of developing a fund, basically, where developed nations can contribute in order to offset the damage that is going to happen to much of the developing world because of climate change that was majorly caused by countries in the developed world.
Okay, so we got one question on is the problem institutional or is the problem moral, effectively, and the others about the global fund, which actually does exist.
If I could ask the first one, and Martin answer the second, or do you want to answer the first one?
I'll answer both, but you start. You start.
I think that the sort of phenomenon of thinking of weighting the immediate future more than, than later is encapsulated in all the economics of discount rates and so on, and I think that probably reflects a proper assessment of the way humanity behaves. I think the issue in terms of institutional problems are obviously, in a sense, it's part of the cost of democracy. Now, I think it is arguable that particular states do think more into the long term because they're not focusing on the next election. And I think that is one of the sort of, as it were, the ironies or dilemmas and paradoxes of the way that one sees operational. I think there are exceptions. For example, I think that if you think about, even let's say within the UK, obviously there's a lot of imperatives to win the next election in 2015. But at the same time, some of the investments and decisions that are being taken, particularly in education and infrastructure, go way beyond that. So I think that they're partial, whereas very long-term thinking tends to be coming from societies where actually you're not going to see much change in terms of the political system unless there's something rather dramatic happens.
I agree with that. I mean, I do think that the quarterly report by public companies and things like that does encourage short-termism. So if you look at companies, often the privately owned ones, which are, Dyson, JCB, and companies like that, which perhaps plan ahead more than some public companies. But as far as individuals are concerned, I think there's a mixture. I mean, obviously, people's subjective discount rate, well, if they need to go to Wonga, it's very high indeed. On the other hand, if they're thinking about the welfare of their grandchildren, then they apply a psychological small discount rate. They do care equally about their grandchildren and them. And I think the point that we made in the Commission report was that there are lots of issues where we should apply the low discount rate and think long term, because we are thinking about the welfare of future generations. And as Nick Stern put it, being born late should not be a disadvantage.
And on the point that woman raised about a fund, that of course was originally part of the Copenhagen discussion, $100 billion a year to be set aside by the rich countries for developing countries. When they passed the plate around, not enough was put into it, barely $1 billion. So that's the basic problem, the rich countries. And then you got into these conversations around airline taxes and various other ways of trying to fund such a thing. But that's very much on the table, and indeed many of the biggest developing countries don't want to move until they see that becoming an actuality. So I think it's absolutely part of the deal, including the technological transfers and other things that will have to happen with it. We barely have time for 2 questions, so there are 2 hands there. Keep your questions very pointed. We'll have to keep our responses pretty pointed as well.
It is a COP question. Do we just stop hoping that United Nations will address these issues in any effective way?
Okay. Short but not sweet.
Ian Yorston, do we need more scientists in politics? And if so, how do we achieve that?
Okay. Those two good questions to it.
Well, let me answer both of them. I think the UN system has got some real flaws in it. I think the problem is a combination of a very, very large number of nation states with no weighting of the voting. Vanuatu has the same vote as China. That is a big problem, and any attempt to change that system of voting, or in terms of moving away from a consensus to a majority voting, will be resisted. So I think that to an extent that presents a real problem. I think the second question, which is to do we need more scientists in politics? I think we probably need more scientists. I'm not so sure we need more in government. There's only one MP that I'm aware of who actually has, is a recent graduate. And his father is a professor at Cambridge. But I think that the job of people like myself, who are, chief scientists advising cabinet and the prime minister and so on, is with the exception of some ghastly complexity which Martin knows much more about in cosmology or string theory, you should be able to characterize in a simple and logical way the key issues that politicians need to make decisions about. And if you can't, and they sort of say, oh, this is too hard, my brain hurts, you failed. So I don't think you necessarily need scientifically trained politicians, though it is interesting that if you look at the Chinese Politburo, the vast majority of them have engineering or science backgrounds, and we don't have that.
Yeah. On the UN, another point, of course, is it has many of its agencies that have been set up, and one thing we said in the report was there should be a sort of review of whether all 20 or so agencies of the UN need to continue or need to be modified. So there needs to be some thinking there. As far as scientists and politics are concerned, then I think we would hope that politicians have some feel for uncertainty and risk and numeracy, as indeed one would hope all citizens do. But I think if we ask what should scientists do, I mean, I hope some will go into Parliament to be politicians, but I think scientists need to engage more, because if they engage with public discussion as citizens, then they can at least ensure that the debate is above the level of slogans. It addresses the real issues. And I think, as I said in my remarks, the fact that it's possible to blog and use social media means that scientists, even those with no institutional standing or formal position, can have a big following and can have a real influence. And I think this is a really benign development, and I think more scientists need to engage and be encouraged by their employers, be they universities or companies, to engage in this way, because that'll educate the public and make people aware of all these issues.
There was a really good example last year when the development of the GM technology at Rothamsted, yes, in which you embedded a peppermint gene into a wheat plant, producing a pheromone that was the alarm pheromone for aphids, which are a major pest of wheat, was attacked by the NGO community, some in the NGO community, saying, oh, this is going to be dreadful. There was a movement to actually destroy the crops, the experimental crops that were being grown. And actually that completely was dissipated by the scientists involved debating, going into the media, offering to debate with the individual NGOs about it. And what we thought would be a demonstration of 20,000 people to try and rip up these plants was less than 200, of which well over half those attending were French.
I think that's a very good point. We'll have to ask John afterwards why nationality bias came into that. But science and education, getting scientists to help us think about things, is obviously what we've had tonight in great abundance. Lord Rees was the president of the Royal Society. That is the body of scientists, the most learned scientists in the UK, and as the Astronomer Royal is also continues to perform that leading role in science. And Sir John Beddington was the chief scientist, so it's really been a fantastic opportunity to engage with them. Gary Kasparov, who follows in half an hour, is not a scientist, but he has a brain that is a bit like a machine. And so I encourage you to stay for that. That'll be at 5:30, and let us thank Sir John and Lord Martin for a really terrific set of presentations.
Quite fun.